My name is Donald Barclay. I'm the author of Disinformation, the Nature of Facts and Lies in the Post-Truth Era, a book that was published by Rowman Littlefield in April of 2022. And I'm recreating a presentation I gave yesterday on May 3rd, 2022 for the University of California Merced Center for the Humanities. And in my presentation, I'm going to talk about my book. And this book is actually a continuation of a book I wrote, and it was published also by Rowman and Littlefield, this one in 2018. And my earlier book, Fake News, Propaganda, and Plain Old Lies, was more or less a how-to book. It tried to explain to people how to deal with information, disinformation, misinformation, how to think about what makes information more or less credible, and to make sound judgments about information. My current book, Disinformation, is not so much a how-to as a how-come. How come the digital world and the world at large is in such a fraught, contentious state about the nature of facts and truth? How come we're dealing with so much mis and disinformation, and why it's so hard to separate credible from less credible information? And I don't think that I came up with any kind of grand unified theory to explain it all, but I think I did come up with some ideas that I think are worth talking about and teasing out and criticizing and taking apart, which all ideas should be eventually, and I'm sure my ideas will be. So what I'm talking about today is chapter 4 of my book, which is entitled, As We May Come to Think, How Technology Changes the Way We Think. Now this chapter kind of makes sense. It comes out of chapter 3 of my book, and chapter 3 used as its launching point an essay that was published in July of 1945 called As We May Think. And the author of this essay was an engineer and public intellectual named Vannevar Bush. And in this article, Bush, who was writing at a time before there was digital technology, so he's thinking in terms of analog technology, was imagining a future in which scientists, engineers, and other people would be able to record and store and share information. And even though he was thinking in terms of analog technology and the limitations of analog technology, the ideas he proposed, especially when you read them today, sound very much like, oh, that's the internet he's talking about. He's talking about personal computers and hypertext and all these tools we now use to communicate with each other. So it was a very forward-thinking essay. Bush was fairly optimistic that science and engineering were going to move the world forward in a good direction, just as they had helped to win the war, something that he was involved in. And he believed that access to all this vast amount of information that he was imagining would lift up humanity, would make us able to think more clearly and be more objective. Now, obviously, his optimism has been somewhat disproven because the access to all this information has not necessarily achieved this goal. So what I'm going to talk about today is how the technology of digital technology specifically may very well be changing the way we think. I'm talking about a big technology transfer that we've been dealing with for a while now. And of course, to talk about a technology transfer, obviously I'm going to start by talking about horses. Now, horses, of course, are not technology, they're animals. But humans use horses as technology. They use them as tools to do things. Humans use horses for transportation. They use them to do work. Historically, they've used them for fighting. They use horses for sport and entertainment. They even use horses for psychological therapy, mental health. So horses are used very much in technological ways, and I want to talk about one of the most well-known and significant technology transfers in the history of the world, which was the technology transfer of the horse to the New World. The Spanish brought the modern horse to the New World in the 1550s, and the horse spread to different extents, spread throughout the New World. But I'm specifically going to focus on the spread of the horse in Western North America, in part because that's where horse culture reached its zenith in the form of the Plains Indians, who really took horse culture to a high level. And it's important to understand that the spread of the horse is a technology transfer, because if you don't know about horses, if you don't have any experience with horses, the idea that you can just jump on a horse and start riding is not an accurate description of how the technology gets transferred. When the Spanish brought the horse, they tried to control the technology by not allowing Native Americans to use it, but eventually Native Americans who were allied with the Spanish learned to use horses. They learned the technology, and there's a lot to learn. You have to learn how to ride a horse, how to control a horse, how to train a horse, how to feed a horse, how to breed a horse, how to take care of its illnesses and injuries. There's a lot to know about horses. There's a lot of technology to master before you become the master of a horse culture. And anyway, as different groups got the horse culture and learned to use it, they realized, oh, our neighbors who don't have horse culture yet would give us stuff we want in exchange for horses, but we have to show them how to use it so they understand why horses are valuable. So that the tribes would train the next tribe up. Oh, here are horses, here's how you use them. Oh, we want horses. Oh, we can provide horses. And it was very an economically based system, and it reached its limits. You can see its northern limits were basically climate limits. That's about as far north as you can successfully maintain horse herds. Okay, so that was how the horse spread. And we have these, I think, very romantic ideas about horse culture epitomized by the tribes of the Great Plains. And we imagine these Native American groups as these nomadic hunter-warrior tribes who totally adopted the horse, who changed their culture to accommodate the horse technology, and became masters of vast swaths of the American interior. And this is a painting by Charles Russell that was executed in 1908, and a very romantic vision of Plains Indians on horseback at the zenith of their power of the horse culture. We have these romantic ideas, and then we have historians like Pekka Hämäläinen who come along and kind of rain on our romantic parades by introducing things like facts and evidence to say, well, it wasn't exactly like what you think, and actually maybe it wasn't as great as you think it is. And I'm going to now read a quote from Hämäläinen that from this article that he wrote and published in 2003, in which he talks about Plains Indian culture and some of the issues that arose with this culture. Hämäläinen writes, and I quote, "Horses did bring new possibilities, prosperity, and power to Plains Indians, but they also brought destabilization, dispossession, and destruction. The transformational powers of horses was simply too vast. Although Plains Indians had experienced constant and profound culture changes before European contact, the sudden appearance of horses among dog-using, pedestrian people set off changes that could spin out of control as easily as they could make life richer and more comfortable. Horses helped Indians do virtually everything: move, hunt, trade, and wage war more effectively. But they also disrupted subsistence economies, wrecked grassland and bison ecologies, created new social inequalities, unhinged gender relations, undermined traditional political hierarchies, and intensified resource competition and warfare. The introduction of horses, then, was decidedly a mixed blessing. The horse era began for most Plains Indians with high expectations, but soon collapsed into a series of unsolvable economic, social, political, and ecological contradictions." And I think you may be saying to yourself, aha, Donald, I see what you're doing there. You're suggesting that this big technological, cultural change that resulted from the horse coming to the New World has parallels in our own adoption of digital technology. And in fact, yes, that's what I'm saying. And there are some differences, though. One of the things about Native American horse culture, especially among the Plains Indians, was that the acquisition of horses became a goal in and of itself, that having large herds of horses became more important than anything that technology could actually do for the people, economically, survival, whatever. So Native Americans grew their horse herds, especially on the plains, too large for their culture's own good. And of course, we live in a neoliberal, capitalist, market-driven economy, so we would never let our horse herds grow larger than they need to be for our own good. And we would never let things like our transportation, the way it signifies wealth and power and social status and politics and masculinity, we would never let those signifiers drive us to make economic decisions that are not wise and rational, because we're wise, rational people. So this technology transfer I'm talking about, the digital age began in 1947. It's as good a year as any to say that's when the digital age began. So we've really been dealing with digital technology for 75 years. But when you think about digital technology affecting everyday life, of being part of the life of ordinary people, we're really talking more about 30 years, and it's still ongoing. We haven't reached the northern limits of this technology transfer. And Native Americans, by the way, in Western North America, had 220 years to adjust to this technology transfer. So we've experienced a lot of change in a short period of time. When you talk about technology transfer, it's important to talk about technological determinism, which is an old idea. It was first discussed by Thornton Velbin in the early 20th century, I believe. And it's a fairly simple idea. Technology can drive the way cultures think and act and behave. There's different kinds of technological determinism. There's hard technological determinism. And if you're a hard technological determinist and you looked at the spread of horse technology in Western North America, you would say technology is all-powerful. It runs roughshod right over culture, and that the horse in North America was like an invasive species or a virus against which Native Americans had no immunity. The horse, as technology, sought out a toehold in these cultures wherever it could get a toehold in order to propagate itself, and it was as irresistible to Native American cultures as iron tools, firearms, alcohol, and smallpox itself. Similarly, a hard technological determinist would say, our consumer culture of the 21st century, we really don't have any immunity to these consumer technologies that are coming to us through the digital medium. That these are all powerful in shaping us. Now, that's one view of technological determinism. There's also soft technological determinism. And a soft technological determinist would say, well, Native American of the plains, their cultures really were transformed in a big way. But look, for example, at the Native Americans of California. Some of these California Native Americans adopted horse culture, but they didn't adopt it as to the extent that the Plains Indians did. They didn't become wandering nomads. Their cultures were transformed, but not as much as the Plains Indian cultures were transformed. And this is due to things like climate and geography and the social structure of California Native American groups, as well as the social control that was exhibited by the mission system. So it was a change, but not as hard as, and not irresistible. And in the technology world, a soft determinist would say, yeah, digital technology is really powerful, but we have the power to resist it. We don't have to be slaves to this technology. Along similar lines, there's the idea of the neutral view of technology, and this is something you hear, for example, in people who own firearms. They'll say, guns are not bad. Guns are neutral. They can be used for good things, they can be not used at all, and they can be used for bad things. It depends on the people using them. And so the neutral view of digital technology might say, well, here's somebody raising money for Doctors Without Borders, and most of us would agree that's a good thing to do. Good use of technology. Here's somebody issuing death threats to a woman because she dared to claim to know something about online gaming. Most people would say that's a bad use of technology. So technology neutral. There's also the social determinism view, and a social determinist would say, look, technology is created by people. Society socially constructs technology. And so instead of technology controlling society, society controls technology. So the example of the atomic bomb, during World War II, society said, we need to create weapons to win this war as quickly and efficiently as possible. Society saying that allowed us to create the weapons and actually to use those weapons because of the social milieu of World War II. On the other hand, you might look at the Cold War, 50 years of the Cold War, and say, well, even during those 50 years, the belligerents had nuclear weapons, the social milieu was such that they never used them. So society determines technology. However you look at technology, I think all of these questions about do we control technology, does technology control us, relate to this chicken-egg question that I'm sure almost everybody has heard expressed in one way or another. And it really is a chicken-egg question. I can't answer. I don't know. Did digital technology create all this anger and hate that we're seeing online, or was it just there and digital technology gave it a voice? I think that's something we can argue about for a long time. So I'm looking now at an article that was published in The Atlantic. And by the way, The Atlantic is the same magazine that published Vannevar Bush's article As We May Think in 1945. So in 2013, they got historian James Fallows, and they got a group of experts from different fields together to make a list of the 50 greatest breakthroughs in technology and to rank them from 50th to 1st. And like a lot of these ranking lists, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, they're fun to look at, and you can argue about what was left off and what was included, and should something have been higher or lower. It's sort of like arguing about, who are the 25 greatest left-handed point guards in the history of the NBA. Well, there's never going to be a definitive list where everybody agrees, oh, that's right, they're all on there and they're all ranked correctly. But I want to talk about some of the items that showed up on this list. Number 6 on this list was the invention of paper. Paper was invented in China about 2,000 years ago. It made it to Europe about 1085 AD in Toledo, Spain. And of course, it's really important in the recording and the sharing of information. It's really fundamental to that. Another technology that was really important, and rank number 2, is electricity. And of course, without electricity, you don't have any digital technology. So number 1 on the list is printing from movable type. Printing from movable type was developed in China in the 12th century, then developed in Korea in the 13th century, and then, as far as we know, independently developed in Europe in the middle of the 15th century. And famously, the Gutenberg Bible, this is a sample of an image from the Gutenberg Bible, was printed around 1450. You often hear the Gutenberg Bible is the first printed book. Well, not exactly. To be very exact, the Gutenberg Bible is, quote, the earliest major book printed using mass-produced movable metal type in Europe. And for all of my University of California fans, I'll point out that there's a shout-out to the University of California. There's our motto right on Genesis 1:1 of the Gutenberg Bible. Okay. So, printing from metal movable type was hugely impactful on European culture. So you see here on the left is the last full century with no printing from movable type number of books produced. On the right, first full century with printing from movable type. An almost 8,000% increase in the number of books produced. This really changed the culture in a big way. Of course, it made more information available, more people became literate, ideas were able to be shared, including scientific ideas. It also made books smaller, because your typical medieval manuscript is a pretty big item, and it made them cheaper. So you could have more books in a smaller space, you could carry books around, you could ship them more easily, and of course they were more affordable. They weren't necessarily cheap, especially at first, with printing from movable type. It took a while, but it wasn't like the medieval book that you sometimes see them chained up so that they don't disappear from the monastery, the library, or whatever. And one analogy you sometimes hear is that before printing reduced the cost of books, buying a book was like buying a vineyard. And then after the price was reduced, it was more like buying a bottle of wine. Okay, jumping ahead now to a book from 1962. The Gutenberg Galaxy, The Making of Typographic Man, which is a book that was written by Marshall McLuhan. And McLuhan was a communication theorist And one of the things he does in the Gutenberg Galaxy is look at how the printing revolution, which kicked off in 1450 and then really started going in the 16th century, how that changed European culture. And Marshall McLuhan's idea was not simply that the printing revolution represented a change in how people went about the business of acquiring and sharing information. He saw it ushering in a fundamental change in human cognition. The printing revolution changed human cognition. And he calls out in the role of the alphabet and of printing in giving a dominant role to the visual sense in language and art and the entire range of social and political life. McLuhan saw printing as changing European culture from a mostly oral culture with a scribal element into a visual culture with, of course, a writing, printing element. And if you're familiar with things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know that for several hundred years, those poems were just kept in memory. And they were kept in the memory of singer poets who had to memorize these long, long poems. Well, the memory was a valued skill. Plato even kind of criticizes writing because it's cheating. It reduces the importance of memory. So McLuhan says, fairly logically, that the spread of printing reduced the value of memory. As a skill, memory lost value because when you can write things down, you don't have to remember them. He also saw the printed book, as changing reading from a communal oral activity to the private silent activity that is practiced today. And by the way, this is a medieval classroom, a university. Probably in this classroom, none of those students could have afforded a book. The professor probably couldn't afford a book either. The book he's looking at is probably the property of the university. And he's reading to his students. That was a typical form of instruction. And in fact, the word lecture that we still use today comes from the Latin word meaning to read. Of course, the book changed that to books were small, they were portable, they were cheap, and you could sit by yourself and read in silence, a different way of exchanging information. McLuhan also sees printing as moving a culture that was oral, storytelling, listening, remembering, imagine a shaman around a fire, to the new culture of looking and recording and observation. Imagine a scientist looking through a microscope, writing things down. McLuhan also ascribes to the printing revolution the rise of nationalism, the rise of individualism, the rise of capitalism, and what he saw as modern humanity's replacement of the sacred with the profane. And to maybe put that in slightly more contemporary terms, what I think he's getting at is what I see as the rise in our culture, the elevation of consumerism and consumer goods to a somewhat sacred status in our consumer culture. A different book on taking a similar parallel track is Elizabeth L. Eisenstein's The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. It's a book I really recommend. Whereas McLuhan was a communications theorist, Eisenstein was a historian, so she takes a slightly different take on the impact of printing, but she comes to parallel conclusions to McLuhan, including that she ascribes to the printing revolution, the Renaissance, scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation. Some pretty big impacts. Again, a book well worth reading for a different take on the question. In his lifetime, McLuhan was a very well-known intellectual, maybe the best-known intellectual in the world. And part of the reason he was so well-known is because in Gutenberg Galaxy and other books, he not only writes about the impact of the printing revolution and how that changed human cognition, he writes and he talks on TV, on talk shows, and interviews on television about how electronic medium, especially television, is ushering in a similar change in the way people think. And so he saw a new revolution unfolding in the form of electronic information. And McLuhan died in 1980, so he did not live long enough to really see the digital revolution unfold. But when you listen to him and read his work from the context of the 21st century, you go, oh, he really was sort of talking, the things he's talking about are things we're experiencing now. We do seem to be undergoing this change in the way we think because of electronic technology. And I've got a little clip here of McLuhan. McLuhan saw the world moving into a post-literal world because of electronic technology. And he saw the world becoming a global village, which is a phrase that he coined. In a global village in which everyone on the planet is connected by shared communication technology powered by electricity.
But not only is the world getting smaller, it's becoming more available and more familiar to our minds and to our emotions. The world is now a global village. A global village.
Okay, McLuhan is filmed here in front of a pay telephone. I think that's quite intentional because the telephone and radio and electronic and TV were all part of this electronic ways of communicating that he saw changing the way people think. And it's interesting, like I said, McLuhan was well known in his time. If you've ever seen the movie Annie Hall, he actually has a cameo in that movie as himself. And after his death, McLuhan's stock as a scholar and as an intellectual kind of went down. People saw him as somewhat old-fashioned, out of touch. But I really think that in the digital age, his stock is rising because he is the things he said about technology. I think are really seem appropriate and on the mark for what we're experiencing in the digital age. Okay, his view of technology was not positive necessarily, not 100% positive. And he wrote, instead of tending towards a vast Alexandrian library, the world has become a computer, an electronic brain, exactly as in an infantile piece of science fiction. And as our senses have gone outside us, Big Brother goes inside. So, unless aware of this dynamic, we shall at once move into a phase of panic terrors, exactly befitting a small world of tribal drums, total interdependence, and superimposed coexistence. And then again, in light of what's happening in the digital world, when you see things like Big Brother, panic terrors, tribal drums, superimposed coexistence, you really, at least I start saying, I think McLuhan was really onto something there. McLuhan was very prescient. Okay. Following McLuhan, you have Walter J. Ong, who was actually a student and colleague of McLuhan. And these are Ong's two big works on how writing and technology are changing the way people think. And before I jump into Ong's ideas, I really want to quickly go over the 4 stages of communication technology, because these are really important to understanding Ong. So the oldest form of communication technology is oral communication, speaking. It's what I'm doing right now. It's kind of what makes human beings stand out from the other creatures, that we can speak. And by the way, none of these forms of communication supplant the previous form. They just add on. So after oral, you have scribal technology. And in scribal cultures, you have a relatively elite few people who can read and write, and the amount of information produced is fairly small because each piece of information is a unique creation. Then you have print technology, which we've already talked about, how it can mass produce information and distribute it quickly and fairly cheaply. And then you have electronic information, started with the telegraph, then the telephone, wireless radio, television, and now digital technology, which of course makes the transmission of information even easier and cheaper and faster. Okay, so Ong had this to say about writing. He said, without writing, the literate mind would not and could not think as it does, not only when engaged in writing, but normally even when it is composing its thoughts in oral form. More than any other single invention, writing has transformed human consciousness. So rather than talking about print specifically, Ong talks about writing. And Ong argues that anybody who is literate, who has the power to read and write, can't really imagine what it's like to live in a culture without reading and writing, because writing shapes the way we think. And we think as literate people. And we can't imagine what it is to be pre-literate. So, speaking about different cultures, Ong talks about primary orality, which is a culture that's totally untouched by writing, where everything is speech and listening and memory. And really, there aren't very many primary orality cultures left in the world where they just haven't been touched by writing at all. And then there's print culture and writing culture, which we've already talked about. But Ong sees the world moving into something he calls secondary orality. And he talks about present-day high-technology culture in which a new orality is sustained by telephone, radio, television, and other electronic devices that depend for their existence and function on writing and print. So secondary orality doesn't erase print and writing, but it builds on it in a different way and leads to a different way of thinking, a different kind of human cognition. So when I look around at digital technology, I see things like Twitter as being a secondary orality kind of medium of communication. TikTok, Twitch, Snapchat, Instagram, podcasts, texting. I see all of these as being secondary orality mediums that build on writing and print, but take it in a different direction. This leads us to 21st century ideas about the Gutenberg parenthesis. And this is an idea that a number of 21st century scholars are discussing. And the term was coined by a scholar named Lars Ole Sauerberg. And the idea is fairly simple. You had oral scribal culture, and then for 500 or 600 years you had print culture, as exemplified by the Gutenberg press, and then printing in all its various forms over the years. And that now we're moving into secondary orality, a new kind of culture that is in which, to use Sauerberg's words, we're moving from the rationality accompanied by the printed book to an altogether different way of processing, characterized by interactivity and much faster pace. The book as privileged mode of cognition is, it seems, being marginalized and transformed. And so I see in digital technology, yes, interactivity and faster pace, yeah, that's what Twitter and these other forums are all about. So one of Sauerberg's colleagues is a literary scholar named Tom Pettit. And Pettit writes about how both different cultures and subcultures entered into the Gutenberg parenthesis, entered into the world of print at different rates and different times depending on the subculture, and by extension that we're exiting it at different times. So Pettit would never say, oh, well, on October 25th, 2025, we're all going to step over a line and we're magically going to be beyond the Gutenberg parenthesis. No, he's saying different cultures entered and will exit the Gutenberg parenthesis differently. And he uses the example of Shakespeare's sonnets and Shakespeare's plays. But he starts with Shakespeare's sonnets, which were published in 1609, and they have the author's name on the title page. And this makes perfect sense because poetry was part of established Elizabethan literary culture, and Elizabethan literary culture was well into the Gutenberg printing world by 1609. It had been in printing for a long time by 1609. Why is that? Well, printing elevated the importance of the author. Before printing from movable type, you couldn't really make a living as an author because the value of the printed object was in the object. That's where all the cost and effort really was. The writing was important, but less important. But with printing from movable type, which rose up with capitalism, an author like Shakespeare could make money by printing literary sonnets and selling them. So it's important then that the author's name appears attached to the work. Now, this is the fourth edition of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, published in 1622. And this is the first edition in which Shakespeare is identified as the author. There were 3 editions of Romeo and Juliet before this that don't even mention the author. Why is that? Well, Pettit contends that Elizabethan theater was not as far into the Gutenberg parenthesis, had not gotten into the Gutenberg parenthesis at the time Shakespeare's plays were being produced. And there's reasons for this. First of all, in Elizabethan theater, you didn't make your money printing scripts, you made your money staging plays. So the play is the thing. Also, theater culture, first of all, it borrows more heavily from previous works. Romeo and Juliet was based on an Italian play. Everybody knew that. It was a sampling. Elizabethan theater was more improvisational, and it was more collaborative. You have authors improvising lines and adding to the script and so on. So the author is important, and people in Shakespeare's time knew who he was and they knew he wrote plays, but not as important as it is to something like sonnets. So Pettit says, just as different subcultures entered the Gutenberg parenthesis at different times depending on their orientation to print, they're exiting at different times. And Pettit compares Elizabethan theater to hip-hop music, in which you have sampling, borrowing from earlier works, and you have contributions by multiple artists, and you have improvisation, and you have interactivity with the audience. These are all features of secondary orality, and in a way, jazz music is similar with its improvisation. And, any kind of call and response culture has that sort of improvisation and interactivity that's more secondary orality than it is Gutenberg parenthesis. And that's why something like hip-hop is more likely to move beyond the Gutenberg parenthesis and more quickly move on than something like writing short stories or writing novels, where the author is central. And so that's why we're moving at different paces. Now, if we're moving into secondary orality, if we're in a post-literate world where the centrality of the book and the printed word is not what it used to be, my question is, how is that impacting the polarization that we're seeing in the digital world? Is it impacting it, and how? And I think it is impacting, so I'm going to talk about how I think that's happening. I'm going to talk about this man, Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States. And I see Donald Trump as a real secondary orality figure. First of all, Trump is a television native. Television was the medium that inspired McLuhan's thinking about this electronic revolution changing the way people think, changing human cognition. And I would argue that probably for a lot of people, especially people who like Donald Trump and vote for him, he became known to them through television. That was the medium from which he emerged. He's a television native. Television, very secondary orality, electronic form of communication. At least for a while, Trump was one of the masters of Twitter. And he may become the master of Twitter again now that Elon Musk has purchased it, and maybe he's going to let Donald Trump back on. But Twitter is a very secondary orality kind of medium. It's performative, it's interactive, it's fast-paced, it's improvisational. So Trump could send out a tweet, and his audience, his stands could come back and go, right on, Donald Trump, way to own the libs. And his haters could go, Donald Trump, you suck, you're missing the point, you don't understand reality. And if Trump wanted to, he could respond to a stan or a hater as he chose and make it a very interactive performance. This is very different than, let's say, a policy wonk like Al Gore writing a 10,000-word essay on with footnotes on climate change and publishing it in a journal, which is a very Gutenberg parenthesis thing to do, but not a very secondary orality thing to do. And it's not surprising that some of the people who were most well known for coming back at Trump on Twitter were stand-up comedians like Sarah Cooper and Patton Oswalt, because stand-up comedy is a very secondary orality medium. It depends on writing, because most stand-up comedians write their routines, but it takes it in the secondary orality because the routines themselves are somewhat improvisational, they're performative, they're interactive with the audience. And if you've ever heard a recording of a stand-up comedian or watched a video of a stand-up comedian, they're almost inevitably done before a live audience, because stand-up comedy without a live audience is pretty blah. And Twitter without the response and the interactivity is pretty blah. The fun of a tweet is not as much Donald Trump said something, that's part of the fun, but the fun, the entertainment, the stimulation, whatever you want to call it, is people responding to that and then responding to each other's responses. So for someone who would wear a shirt like this, who goes, look, the Gutenberg parenthesis, this written record we have, where we've done the work and we've learned and we've built on what we know and we've actually changed the way what we've said as we learn more. And science is this thing that keeps advancing and moving on as it learns more. And we have facts. We know that polio was wiped out by a vaccine. Read a book, folks. People who would wear this shirt are really disturbed by the idea that in secondary orality, facts don't carry the weight they do within the Gutenberg parenthesis. That somebody like Donald Trump can say things that are alternative facts and his followers can accept them, and that credible facts seem to bounce off Donald Trump like bullets off of Iron Man's suit. Why is this so? Why can this happen? And this really disturbs people who are science-oriented and Gutenberg parenthesis people. I think there's an analogy in the folk song. And the Big Rock Candy Mountain is a well-known American folk song. There are hundreds of versions of it. There are versions for little kids that are literally sung by little kids in grade schools. There are pop music versions. There are country music versions. Burl Ives has a version. Burl Ives, if you don't know who he is, he was the voice of the snowman in the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer stop animation film that's shown every year in the United States at Christmas time. There are old-time music versions, lots of versions, hundreds of versions. And some of them are very similar, but they have different lyrics and ways of presentation. And there's even a version from the 19th century in which a hobo comes down the lane, he's singing about the Big Rock Candy Mountain, and the young farm boy goes off with the hobo in search of the Big Rock Candy Mountain, and the young hobo becomes the sex victim of the predatory hobo who led him to the Big Rock Candy Mountain. And in the 19th century version of the song, the young boy literally says, "I've been buggered sore like a hobo's whore." That's not a version you're going to sing in grade school, especially in Florida these days. But the point is that there's lots of versions of the Big Rock Candy Mountain, but there's no right version. The version that's right is the one that you like. If you like the little kid version, that's fine. If you like the Burl Ives version, if you like the version your grandma used to sing to you, if you like the sexual exploitation version, fine. They're all equally valid. And somebody might say, well, Harry McClintock, he copyrighted the song. He was the first person to write down and copyright it. Yeah, but McClintock even said, yeah, well, I based this on versions I heard traveling around. And in fact, the Big Rock Candy Mountain, in the words of a folklorist, quote, belongs to a long tradition of songs and poems depicting a secular utopia free of the stresses and concerns of everyday life. So it's a very old song, and in fact, copyright belongs in the golden arches of the Gutenberg parenthesis. It doesn't belong before or after, really. It's only when, during that period when making money from printing things was profitable and could really be controlled, that it really matters. In the digital age, where we're moving to a secondary orality and where copyright is harder and harder to control because digital technology makes it so easy to copy things, copyright becomes less of a factor. So, there's a freedom in the secondary orality because it allows for greater choice and freedom and individual preference. And Tom Pettit writes, while we may welcome the freedom these developments offer, the reminder that they are effectively taking us back into the Middle Ages, that we are surfing to serfdom, should give some pause for thought. Yes, the fact that we may be moving to a world where, there's a bunch of different facts here, they're contradictory, pick the one you like, may be a very dangerous position to be in. Now, the good side of it is, we can do different things now. We can think differently. Well, you can't have a black Thomas Jefferson. Oh, yes, we can. Here he is on the Broadway stage. That's a good thing. That's the freedom. That's the freedom and openness of hip-hop music. But on the other hand, the freedom to ignore facts, to say, I reject your Gutenberg parenthesis scientific findings that say smoking causes lung cancer and heart disease and emphysema, and low birth weight babies and secondhand smoke is terrible for other people. I reject those facts because I'm just so secondary to reality. I can choose to ignore them and decide that smoking's fine and I'm just going to do it wherever I want, whenever I want. That is a very dangerous way to think about things, to simply ignore this body of evidence and facts that have been developed over the years. I'm going to jump back to Vannevar Bush, who I talked about earlier. In his lifetime, Bush was a very well-known public intellectual. He was an engineer, an inventor, and what he was probably best known in his lifetime for was when he was a civilian head of the Office of Scientific and Research Development during World War II. And this was a civilian agency that was charged with inventing weapons and equipment for the military to help them win the war. As head of this agency, Bush was a civilian in charge of this. Bush was at the Trinity site when they set off the first atomic bomb. He was there when J. Robert Oppenheimer famously said, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." So even though Bush was very optimistic when he wrote As We May Think, and it was published in July of 1945, before the use of the bomb, he knew some things most people didn't know. He knew that the bomb existed, he knew that it worked, and he knew that it was going to be used on people very soon. And so that means that there's a pessimism that accompanies Bush's optimism about the future, because he understood people were at an inflection point. Humanity was at an inflection point. So even though that humanity may encompass the great record and grow in the wisdom of race experience, and by race he means human race, not African, Asian, white, humanity may perish in the conflict before he learns to wield the record for his true good. So access to all this information, which Bush was imagining in his essay, could lift us up, but it could also destroy us. We're at an inflection point. I think this is reflected in McLuhan's thoughts about electronic technology, the electronic brain. The idea that we may be moving in a phase of panic terrors, exactly befitting a small world of tribal drums, total interdependence, and superimposed coexistence. McLuhan saw us at an inflection point, but he does give us, I believe, an out, a possible way out of this problem. He says, unless we're aware that the world, because of technology, may be going through a cognitive change as great as that imposed by the printing revolution, and that we are experiencing this at different rates and to different degrees depending on our culture and subculture. Are we rich, poor, black, white, American, European, African? Are we people who read a lot? Are we TV people? Are we older? Are we younger? All these factors are at work on us. If we understand that this change is happening and that it's happening unevenly, then maybe we can have some empathy and patience and understanding for those who are experiencing it differently. And through this empathy and understanding and patience, maybe, just maybe, we will survive this inflection point and come out of it as a better human race than we were before we went on into it. That's my talk, and thank you for sticking with me as I go over these ideas.